I'm really quite embarrassed and certainly very sad that I can't be with you in person today. I don't like dropping out of things at the last minute, but the reason is I had, for the last month, a quite severe sinus infection and I was told not to fly. But I'm glad of the opportunity to do this online, because even though I can't be with you at the conference, which I've been following for years, and I think Miroslav tried to invite me before and I was really excited to come, but it wasn't possible. And one of the reasons I was looking forward to coming, because one of the first places in the world where I visited and started looking into underground metal schemes was actually Czechia. I went to Prague in the early 1990s and looked through record stores and found tapes by Czech death metal bands that I'd never heard of before, and I bought a whole stack of them home. The most famous one, I think, was Kramathor, if people have heard of them, which I'm sure the Czech contingent here has. It's also a bit strange because on Monday, the Jewish rabbinic seminary I teach at actually ordained the first female Czech rabbi. So again, it's very sad I'm not able to come. I would invite anybody who might have wanted to have a chat in coffee to get in touch with me afterwards, and maybe we can have a conversation online. I've put my email address onto the last slide. So I'm going to talk for about maybe 40 minutes and then take questions. So I'm going to be looking at disability as a form of transgression in metal. So in that respect, it's quite relevant that I'm not well enough to come, because I'll be talking about sickness and disability and illness today. But first of all, transgression. It was, I think, inevitable that metal would at some point come to be understood through the lens of transgression. One of the attractions of transgression as a concept is that it is grounded in the bedrock of what it is to be human. Transgression is not a practice that emerged recently, but it can be found throughout human history, albeit taking very different forms in different times and places. It appears to be a near universal that humans create boundaries of various kinds, and that humans often cross those boundaries too. Indeed, boundaries are often created for the purpose of transgressing them. One of the great achievements of 20th century philosophy and social science was the revelation that the universality of boundaries means that those boundaries are necessarily arbitrary. Structuralist anthropology demonstrated that while the details of myths and practices may differ wildly over time and space, they share a similar set of oppositions and taboos. At the same time, boundaries often structure a common object, the body. The body, with all its desires, its excretions, its vulnerability, and its messiness, is ordered in society by boundaries that define how it should be displayed, how it should be maintained, and how it should be made clean and social. The dangerous allure of the body, its simultaneous eroticism and mortality, ensures that the boundary making is both a social necessity and also that transgressing those boundaries is appealing. So when we say that transgression is one of the main characteristics of metal, we are connecting metal to the foundations of human civilization. And while transgression is not unique to metal, it is certainly a culture that is much more aware and self-conscious in how it tries to tap into the deeply rooted genealogy of human civilization. That said, metal's self-consciousness is limited, and transgression is, as I've argued, neither universally practiced nor universally liberated. Metal sets up its own boundaries and transgresses others. So while, as I've said, it was always likely that at some point somebody would apply the concept of transgression to metal, the fact that I did so in the 1990s in my research wasn't just because of the usefulness of the concept, it was also because in my life at the time, I was confronted with the boundaries and limits of the body in a very direct and personal way. My PhD on extreme metal and transgression was conducted between 1996 and 2001. 1996 was also the year I was diagnosed with ME, sometimes called chronic fatigue syndrome. In 1993, during my second year as an undergraduate, I developed the Epstein-Barr virus. While this was never life-threatening and I appeared to recover in a few weeks, I never fully recovered. In fact, over time, as I tried to live the life of a student, I developed new symptoms, exhaustion and brain fog that came and went but never disappeared. This remains the case today, 30 years later. I still have ME, chronic fatigue syndrome. My condition is variable, sometimes disabling, and even when I do feel fit and healthy, I have to restrain myself from doing too much. My condition cannot be cured by modern medicine, but it can be managed. Since I was diagnosed, I've tried to find a way to live a full and active life in order to minimize the likelihood of a crash where I'm unable to do anything at all. Most of the time I do this successfully. It requires constant monitoring and deep awareness of my limits and how to live within them. So during the time I was studying metal in my PhD, I was also learning how to recognize the limits of my own body. And this wasn't easy. And I had a constant desire to transgress those limits. As a man in my 20s, I wanted to go out drinking, to get stoned, to bang my head at metal gigs. And sometimes I did do this, but there was usually a cost. That need for me to monitor my own limits meant that I was highly attuned to how the people I was studying were dealing with their own limits, their own transgressions. I learned to my surprise that while metal is full of transgression, it's also full of its opposite, the mundane logic of carefully working to build and maintain community. I realized that metal had developed a very sophisticated way to balance the transgressive and the mundane. And perhaps this was a lesson from my own life. If metal could make that balance, maybe I could too. So the question I want to explore in this paper is related to the questions I was asking about my own life in my 20s and the place that metal had within it. What is metal's relationship to disability? And how far are metal cultures decent places for disabled people? As I will argue, metal's transgressive culture is one in which the disabled body does have a presence, but it is often a paradoxical, ironic, and contradictory presence. I'm not going to offer a strict definition of disability here, it's a contested term. What I want to emphasize, though, is that the category encompasses everything from permanent and visible conditions that are acquired from birth to temporary, so-called invisible conditions acquired in the course of life. Generally speaking, it is the former disabilities, permanent, visible, and congenital, that are most commonly classed as disabilities. This can make recognizing and accommodating other invisible disabilities difficult in some contexts. Over the last few years, the metal scholar Jasmine Shadrach and myself have been working on an edited collection on metal and disability, which will be published by Intellect Books early next year. This is the first collection on the topic to be published, and it's been interesting to be part of the start of a conversation on this subject. As one would expect, there is a tentativeness about how to frame the subject and a lack of shared vocabulary. This became clear when we discussed the cover for the book with our publisher. We tried to find a single image that would symbolize metal and disability. The best we could come up with was this, which was a meme that we found online. And of course, the wheelchair is the preeminent symbol of disability and the most visible manifestation of it. However, Jasmine and I immediately realized that this image would not work for our book because the wheelchair renders other disabilities invisible. But if we couldn't use the wheelchair, what would we use? We tried to failed to come up with a more universal image, but in the end we failed and came up with this cover. So even if associating disability with a skull and death is a problem, both Jasmine and I decided the image was too great not to use. Well, nobody is ever entirely consistent, least of all Jasmine and myself. It wasn't just because the image of the wheelchair wasn't inclusive enough that we rejected it. In fact, the collection doesn't include chapters on those who from birth are unable to walk, although it does include chapters that deal with conditions that result in problems of mobility. Nor in fact does the collection include chapters on visual impairments or hearing impairments. So the disabilities that are most widely recognised are only a minor theme in the book. The book was put together from responses to a call for papers, and many, although not all of the contributors, are from authors who were themselves disabled metalheads. Most of those who contributed have invisible disabilities, like myself. So why were these sorts of people more likely to contribute? Is it simply that there are more people with invisible disabilities than visible ones? Now, of course, there is no absolute difference between visible and invisible disabilities. There are people with conditions like my own who sometimes use wheelchairs and sometimes do not. Some disabilities only become apparent in certain contexts, as with hearing impairments. We should also recognise that there are different kinds of both visibility and invisibility. At concert venues, disabilities may be visible in particular parts of the space and not in others. There's also a distinction between passing as normal in public space, normal in inverted commas, but secretly having an invisible disability, and being invisible because entering public space is impossible due to that disability. Within this complex and shifting totality of disabilities, visible and otherwise, we could say that those with a visible, easily identified and permanent disability are rarely to be found as metal artists. That isn't to say that visible disability is not present in metal at all, or that people with visible disabilities are necessarily discriminated against. One of the rare examples of a metal musician with a visible disability is Rick Allen from Def Leppard, whose left arm was amputated in 1985 following a car accident, and whose career was saved through the development of a specially adopted kit. A less well-known example is Jeff Masaryk, the vocalist of the death metal band Possessed, who was left paralysed from the waist down after being shot in 1989, and who has continued since then to perform from a wheelchair. Metal events have become much more accessible to those with visible and clearly defined disability than once was the case, but usually as audience members rather than artists. For example, the UK's Bloodstock Festival has an ambitious inclusion policy and says on its website, "We encourage people with disability or access needs to get in touch with our team so that we can assist you." They provide an accessible viewing platform together with accessible toilets and camping facilities. Other metal festivals such as Wacken have similarly extensive information on their websites. Now, this may be as part of a wider trend in the live music industry rather than a specifically metal development. Still, the impact of metal of this trend is certainly worth noting. Accessibility and inclusion are much more on the agenda than they once were. What is less clear is whether improved accessibility in public spaces will make any difference to the participation of the visibly disabled in metal as artists. Nor is it clear how metal scenes might differ from other spaces in terms of prejudice and discrimination against those with disabilities. There are certainly aspects of metal discourse that would seem to require a particular body, the potent, able, and often male body. So, for example, Manowar and some other classic metal bands exalt in the sculpted male body and sometimes the sculpted female body too. That doesn't necessarily mean that those with disabilities are treated as imperfect. Most men and women don't fit into that body ideal anyway. The cartoonishness of such forms of metal may be treated as non-serious fantasies by those with or without disabilities, but the potential is certainly present for shaming people with imperfect bodies. Such visible images of bodily perfection are not the whole story though. The limitation of focusing on visible disabilities, narrowly defined, is it detracts attention from the ways in which metal offers an exploration of the ways in which the body is acted upon, damaged, rendered disabled, and weakened. Here, I think we can say that metal does offer multiple resources and provocations that challenge the idea of the healthy body. In fact, even though people with visible disabilities are not well represented in metal as artists, if we view disability in a much broader way, disability represents one of the elements of transgressive culture that is central to metal culture. So I want to consider the ways in which metal is not only fascinated with the disabled body, but can also itself be a transgressively disabling space. This is a vast and largely unexplored topic, and I'm only going to explore a few selected examples here. One topic I'm not going to look at in any detail is metal lyrics, particularly death metal lyrics that focus on the destruction of the body. I will only note that, as I've argued elsewhere, such lyrics may sometimes celebrate the one who inflicts violence, but they also sometimes celebrate the victim of that violence. Black metal is a space within metal culture where the disabled body does have some prominence. One of the ironies of black metal is that, while the genre has often celebrated the potent individual man as a reproach to Christian weakness, artists have frequently done so while displaying a body type that is thin, sick, and suffused with deathly pallor. In other words, they look terrible. The transgression represented by suicide and self-mutilation, as exemplified by Dead and other black metal artists, renders the body broken or damaged. That apparent irony is less contradictory than it might seem. The sick body becomes a defiant parody of the tragic weakness produced by Christianity. Posing underdressed and shirtless, posing underdressed, thin and sickly in the cold, snowy forest doesn't imply imperviousness to cold, so much as a provocative desire to welcome the suffering. To be disabled by cold and weakness here becomes a form of refusal to tame the forces that overwhelm us. To be animalistic is to be unprotected from threatening danger. There is also another way in which black metal invites the disability. It is an exceptionally arduous and tiring music to play. Tremolo riffs, blast beats and screams take their toll on the body. One casualty of this was Demonaz, shown on the left here, who's the guitarist and co-founder of Immortal. He developed tendinopathy and was unable to play guitar from 1997 to 2013, when surgery allowed him to return to guitar playing. And it's surely not a coincidence that Immortal's music involves very, very fast tremolo riffing. This physical arduousness is not unique to black metal. Another example is Tom Araya from Slayer, who was long known for his particularly energetic headbanging. I'm going to play a bit of that now. Now, unsurprisingly, after decades of touring and doing that with his neck, he eventually developed very serious back problems. And this was corrected in 2009 through surgery, but after that he was unable to continue headbanging in the enthusiastic way he had done before. So playing and performing metal can be disabling, sometimes permanently so. Playing at fast tempos, coping with loud volumes, and overdriving the voice of the body are all features of most metal genres. And while other kinds of music outside metal also take their toll, it is reasonable to assume that metal is particularly dangerous in this regard. Maybe there is a certain thrill in watching those whose careers seem to actually invite disabling injury. Sorry. I can't be the only one who marvels at Steve Harris's extraordinary bass style in Iron Maiden, which involves his fingers hitting the string at high tempos. He's now 67 years old and still touring and recording as he's done for decades. Whether he is physically uninjured or whether he's playing through pain, it is equally remarkable to witness his play. We need to recognise the risk that metal artists face in damaging their bodies. While it's common to recognise the self-harm that artists inflict on themselves through drink and drugs, there's much less recognition of self-harm caused in the act of playing itself. To be clear, many other genres require physical exertion. Beyoncé, for example, her shows are lengthy, involving dancing and singing, and they no doubt require her to be at the peak of physical fitness. Some of metal's physical challenge also exist in other genres, but others are unique to it. The disabling qualities of metal are often hidden. Metal values endurance and resilience. Even when frail musicians tour, they simultaneously perform their weakness and continue despite it. Resilience is articulated in metal through persistence and endurance. Yet there are also moments when resilience breaks down, consciously or deliberately. It is in those moments that the contradictory nature of metal's relationship to disability becomes apparent. And as I will go on to show here, when metal's disability is made visible, it constitutes a transgression that is both an expression of metal culture and a challenge to it. Now, I want to first of all acknowledge that there's a wider history in popular music of performing weakness and disability. A famous example is James Brown, who in his live shows would sometimes pretend to be so overcome with emotion that he would literally collapse. His bandmates would pretend to support him off stage, only for him to find a second wind and come back on. And here's a video of him playing the song Please, Please, Please. And note here, this is the second time that he collapses during the song. So of course James Brown was not really collapsing at all, but it's worth noting how this performance renders disabling weakness not a sign of emasculation and frailty, but of an authentic desire and eroticism so powerful that it overwhelms him. Performing the experience of being disabled is an act of revelation, whether or not it reflects a real disability. There are some other examples too that I'm just going to flick through very quickly. Another example is Ian Curtis of Joy Division, who was epileptic and would kind of almost perform this epilepsy on stage like this. Another example is Ian Dury. I'm not sure how famous he was outside the UK, but he was partially paralysed after catching polio, and his confrontational and witty lyrics offered a challenge to notions of disability as weakness. While the public revelation of disability can be oppositional and shocking, it can also produce love and care. A recent example of this was in the 2023 Glastonbury Festival, where the singer Lewis Capaldi was struggling with his mental health, including Tourette's syndrome. His difficulty in performing was evident, but the crowd supported him by singing where Capaldi could not, which was quite a moving occasion. So there are multiple precedents in popular music cultures for acknowledging and performing disability. The question is, how does metal do it? So bear in mind the James Brown video that I played earlier. Here's a clip from the latter part of Judas Priest performing Painkiller at Wacken in 2015. So, like James Brown, Rob Halford seems to be brought to his knees during the lengthy climax of the song. Painkiller is something of an endurance test, given its length, its speed, and for Halford the difficulty in producing its high-pitched vocals. So while Halford's near collapse is likely to be a performative gesture like James Brown's, we should acknowledge that it is an exceptionally tough song to perform. Truly involuntary performances of disability and metal also tell us something. So I'm going to play you a video that you can find on YouTube that was recorded of Morbid Angel playing, the guitarist of Morbid Angel, Transgression, at a gig in New York in April 2023. Sorry. So I don't have time to perform the rest of it, but I should say that about a minute later, he actually goes to the side of the stage and collapses. There are conflicting reports about what exactly happened here, but the consensus seems to be that Azagthoth was suffering from acute back pain and was self-medicating with alcohol. What's clear from the odd position in which he's standing is that the band's fast and complex music looked to be torture to perform. It's at such moments that the human cost of playing metal becomes painfully apparent. Another example can be found in recordings and videos of live performances by Motorhead in 2015 during the last few months of Lemmy's life. This is the official video release of the band's performance in Munich in 2015. This was one of the last performances Motorhead did. But not only does Lemmy look unwell, he's thin, he's pale, he's barely moving. His voice also slurs and seems to be almost overwhelmed by the wall of onstage noise. While Motorhead's music was always grueling to endure, in earlier years he appeared to be totally in control of it. In his last months, he appeared to be on the verge of being destroyed by it. Yet these last performances were still welcomed by fans with overwhelming support and even love. In September 2015, Motorhead played in Austin, Texas. During the song Metropolis, Lemmy was unable to continue and walked off the stage. After gathering himself together, he came back on stage to apologise.
You are one of the best gigs in America, and I would love to play for you, but I can't. Although I'm going to collapse or something. So please accept my apologies.
So the warm response here is a sign of how adored Lemmy was, as well as recognition that he was not the sort of performer who would cancel a gig unless he absolutely had to. Perhaps we could also suggest that this audience reaction acknowledges that the destruction wrought by metal is almost the apotheosis of a metal life well lived. This may be a celebration of the transgressive power of offering up oneself up to metal to be destroyed. After all, Lemmy never promised he would live forever. So there are positive examples of how metal musicians who have become disabled have been treated by audiences and fellow band members. I mentioned Rick Allen earlier. Here's another example, is the drummer of Carcass, Ken Owen, being welcomed on stage by the band in 2008. He was unable to continue in the band following a brain hemorrhage, but they still paid tribute to him here and allowed him to drum.
And we would not be here tonight if it weren't for this guy behind the kits at the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Kenneth Malcolm Owen. Please give him a big hand and support him. He's going to do a drum solo now. This guy went through brain surgery twice, was in a coma for a few months, nearly fucking died. So fucking clap him along now.
This isn't the only such example. I don't have time to show, unfortunately. I have a video of Glenn Tipton of Judas Priest, who for the last few years has been suffering from Parkinson's disease, but he is still occasionally brought on to play one song so that he can keep playing for as long as possible, and he always gets a very good crowd response when he does so. Metal culture is at its best in its loyalty to those who've given so much, even when their bodies no longer function so well. Yet we should also acknowledge that there are also counterexamples. One of these is Mick Mars and Motley Crue. Since the age of 17, he's suffered from a condition called ankylosing spondylitis, which is a type of arthritis that causes pain and impairs movement. One of the astonishing revelations of Motley Crue's autobiography, In the Dirt, is that during the height of their fame in the 1980s, the rest of Mars's bandmates showed absolutely no interest or compassion for him, leading him to self-medicate with alcohol. His ability to play, compose and tour until very recently should have been a cause for celebration, but that never really happened. And having been forced to finally retire from touring earlier in 2023, Mars has sued the band for apparently forcing him out and cutting him out of touring revenue. It is a striking contrast to Judas Priest's treatment of Glenn Tipton. Such callousness may be unusual, but it does raise questions about where the limits of compassion may lie. And I'm going to cut the next little bit, unfortunately, which are some examples of where musicians who have problems with their voice on stage are not necessarily supported. Metal's tolerance for disability seems to be conditional on it being the right kind of disability. Disabilities are accepted provided that the artist is judged to have made a sufficient contribution to metal and displays appropriate levels of resilience. So there is always the possibility of callousness and apathy in metal scenes. An artist has to prove themselves to be worthy of compassion and respect. For younger artists, it's quite possible that the consideration shown by the audience to trainers Agthos or Lemmy would not be extended to them. Now, I don't think there is a single metal attitude to disability, but a complex and contradictory set of practices that construct the metal body. And those practices reflect the paradoxes and contradictions of transgression itself. Courting disability in the destruction of the body invites the transgression of the body's limitations. As such, it both affirms those limits and the bravery it takes to break them. But it is only legitimised in metal if it contains evidence of the previous resilience towards a mastery of those limits. That legitimation enables a kind of care or love towards metal artists. In other words, transgression both harms the metal body, but also allows it to be cared for. There are similar transgressive paradoxes for metal audiences. Listening to metal, watching metal performances, and participating in metal scenes can involve exposure to the very same transgressive possibilities explored by metal artists. But it is never clear when this is a vicarious experience of transgression, kept at a safe distance, or something more dangerous. There's no better way of symbolising the contradictions of metallic transgression than this. Sorry. The earplugs. Once rarely found at metal concerts, they are now commonly used. Some of this has to do with the innovation of custom-fitted in-ear monitors that can moderate volume while still allowing full frequencies of music to be heard. Earplugs in their various forms make perfect sense, yet they raise the obvious question, why play loud if you're going to protect yourself from the loudness? Part of the answers concerns the other physical qualities of loudness, which can be felt in the body without damaging it. Nonetheless, for a scene to venerate the transgressive possibilities of playing loud and yet to resist that transgression is ironic. In this sense, someone like Matt Pipe of Sleep and High on Fire, who makes a point of never wearing earplugs, would seem to be courting, through his self-destructiveness, a transgressive disability. But at the same time, my earplugs also highlight the sheer dangerousness of loudness, preserving the boundary that makes transgression possible. So to conclude, I first of all want to acknowledge that metal is not unique in its potentially disabling qualities, as I've said before. But I'm not sure we can say that metal does disability better than other scenes. But I do think we can say that metal's relationship with disability is distinctive and fits into a wider preoccupation with transgression that is one of the main characteristics of metal. In his extraordinary 2022 memoir called Bodies, the British music journalist Ian Winwood wrote of the music industry that there is something, here we go, people damaged beyond repair are eulogised as fallen heroes whose messy fates are largely connected to the dangerous terrain on which they practice their trade. Those who survive or who seem to will be written up as victors in a war whose rules of engagement are dangerously abstract. We never join the dots. Working on a case-by-case basis, the full story is never told. So here goes. There's something systematically broken in the world of music. It's making people ill. Now, I do think that metal can still is part of the case that Ian Winwood is making. The metal scenes do offer resources and practices that can help address such issues. Metal's distinctive obsessions with boundaries and their transgression allows for, at the very least, an awareness that bodies and minds can be broken and that death awaits us all. And while the temptations of transgression can and do destroy people, they also paradoxically make visible the opposite: care, health, and nurturance. As I said, it's too simplistic to say that metal does disability better, but it's fair to say that metal has the potential to be just that, a space that allows us to accept the brokenness of human existence and yet also to thrive within it. So before I take questions, I'd like to repeat the offer to contact me if you wish. And in particular, I also co-edit a book series with Intellect Books called Advances in Metal Music and Culture, in which the Metal and Disability book will appear. And I would love to publish a collection on metal in the Czech Republic or anything else that you would like to suggest to me. So thank you very much.